We have already created the interface for the login page inside of iOS as well. But currently, it only looks okay on iPhone 6 and all of the other iPhones that have the same screen size. Directly from the controller, we can change the view as from iPhone 6 to iPhone 6 Plus, for example, and now this is not the best. It could still work because we do see the entirety of these elements, but if we were to run this or test this on an iPhone 5, which is only 4 inches, now the elements are hidden. So in this lecture, we're going to learn how to make this work. And like I said, the ideal is to always design your iPhone and iPad interfaces on the generic view. And to make this look okay on all of the screen sizes, we have to move all of the elements so they are back in the position that we want them. We can, for example, set the password entry, or text field, how it's called on iOS, to be right at the middle again, and move this all the way to the right, or make this as wide as possible. The same for the text field for the email. The same thing for the sign in button, which is going to be right below the password text field. And the register button is going to just move its position. Now this is of course not going to be sufficient. If we were to change this back to iPhone 6, you see how now all of the elements are cut. What I want to do is add constraints that are going to define how these elements are going to react to the changes in available space. I'm going to start by defining the constraints for the password entry, because this one is the one that will start defining how the interface is going to look. This one is going to be right in the middle of the screen. And then, relative to this element that is going to be in the middle of the screen, are going to be the other 3 elements. So to be able to add constraints, we have to select the element and then click on it again. And notice how we now see some other tools inside of the element. We see 7 guidelines, 7 new icons that will help us establish the constraints. The T's that are to the sides are going to establish distance from one element to another. The square in the middle is going to establish alignment. And the I's that are to the right and to the bottom are going to establish relationship between one element and another. We can start with the square in this case, because it's the one that will allow me to set a constraint for alignment to the center. And notice that as I drag it, I see some other guidelines relative to this element that I'm dragging. To align this text field to the center of the screen, I can drop this constraint into the guideline that will make this element be perfectly aligned to the center. And notice that as soon as I drop it, the element turns orange and now we see an orange dotted line. This is where the element will appear once the application runs. And notice that if I change the view as for iPhone 6, it is still being displayed right in the center. And so all I have to do is keep adding some constraints for these to look the way I want it. So I'm going to drag the same constraint, this time to center it vertically. As you can see, as soon as we set the element to be vertically aligned, the orange dotted line has changed its position. And again, if we change this to be on an iPhone 6, it remains right on the center. And the same on an iPhone 6 Plus, and on an iPhone 5, and on an iPad. So that is how constraints are going to work. Currently, we have already centered, both horizontally and vertically, our password text field. But currently, it is nowhere near as wide as it should. It should be all the way to the left, with a small margin, and all the way to the right as well. For this, we're going to use the spacing constraints. To the left, we have one spacing constraint that we can drag and drop in the constraint that is over here, with a spacing from a few pixels to the right of the leftmost part of the screen. And the same thing on the other side. And notice that now it looks blue again. This means that it now looks exactly the same as it would look when this runs. And if we change this to be an iPhone 6, you can see where it is going to be standing. And now it's not just an orange dotted line, the one that moves, but the entire element. I'm going to head back to the generic view and add the constraints for the other 3 elements. For the email text field, for example, all we have to do is drag the width size equality relationship, or the constraint that has this I to the bottom of the element, that is going to set the size of this element equal to the other element that we select. So if we select the password text field, now the email text field is going to have the same width as that other text field. And since this text field already has the constraints for it to be always at the margin of the left and the right, this one is now going to have the same constraints. Well, at least when it comes to size, it's going to have the same size. But notice that the dotted line reflects that it's still going to be all the way to the left with no margin and at the top of the screen. And that is definitely not where it should be. But if we set the spacing constraint in relationship to the top of the password text field, notice that it now moves its position closer to the password text field. This constraint has now established always the same amount of spacing between this text field and the top of the password text field. All there's left to do is set some spacing from the left of the screen, aligning this constraint to the left margin. And the element turns blue again because it's now going to look the same way as it looks right now. And notice that it moves now along with the other text field. For the button, we're going to do something similar. We're going to set its width to be the same as the password text field. We had to set some spacing, this time to the bottom of the password text field, and as well some spacing to the left margin of the screen. And for the register button, I want to set some spacing to the bottom of the signing button, and notice that it now displays an orange dotted line to the left of the screen, but with that spacing to the bottom of the signing button already set. Now, what I want to do is set some spacing, but to the right margin in the screen. And this time it's still orange, because the size of this button is going to be slightly smaller than what we have right now, but it's still going to display the entire word. It's going to have the exact size that it needs to display the name or the title inside of the button. You can always just select the update frames based on constraints button that is at the top of the designer for the button to be repositioned and resized to match the constraints. And that's it. These are all the constraints that we need. This time, if we change the view to iPhone 4S, for example, you can see how all of the elements remain looking the same way. The password entry is still at the center of the screen, and based on the position of that password entry, the other elements are being positioned. And the same way if we select the iPhone 5, and the iPhone 6, and the iPhone 6 Plus, and the iPad. So, by adding constraints, our view now works perfectly on all screen sizes. Now that we have our login page ready, in the next lecture, we're going to create the register page. And we're going to learn how we can create new views in the storyboard and how we will have a new view controller for each of these views.